The following presentation will focus on a project to consider the effects of sea level rise for the planning and design of nearshore restoration projects in Puget Sound. I'm Crystal Raymond with the Climate Impacts Group, and this project was developed as a partnership with the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Washington Sea Grant. The final product of this project is a document that summarizes considerations for sea level rise for nearshore restoration projects. This document and related documents are available on the Washington Coastal Network website at the website you see listed here. There are three main objectives of this project. The first objective was to summarize sea level rise impacts and the relevance of the new Washington Coastal Resilience Project sea level rise projections for the planning and design of restoration projects. This document is based on the sea level rise projections that were developed by Miller et al. In 2018. A second objective of this project was to identify key considerations for evaluating sea level rise impacts on restoration projects. And we focus specifically on restoration projects that are designed to restore ecosystem processes. And lastly, this document identifies information needs and resources that can be used to evaluate the considerations of sea level rise. We emphasize that this document is not intended to be prescriptive. It is not intended to tell restoration professionals how to modify a restoration project in order to be more resilient to sea level rise. It is also not intended to be used directly in the review process of grant applications. Rather, it is a resource for restoration professionals to have a structured framework of what to consider when evaluating sea level rise impacts on restoration projects. The geographic scope of this project is consistent with the scope of the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program, which is the coastline of Washington highlighted in red in this map. The geographic extent of the ESRP program covers the inland waters of Puget Sound, extending east from Cape Flattery to the US-Canadian border. The audience for this document is varied, but primarily includes sponsors of restoration projects, as well as potential funders and technical reviewers of restoration projects. We hope that the information provided in this document will be useful to restoration professionals who are responsible for planning and designing restoration projects in this region. This document was developed through a process that involved multiple opportunities for input and feedback from the restoration community. We hosted 2 workshops with nearshore restoration professionals where they identified their needs in such a document and provided feedback on earlier drafts of the document. There was also multiple reviewers from the restoration community who provided feedback along the way. And the structure of this document is based on the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Project. PSNRP is a general investigation that identified a suite of ecosystem processes and management measures that shape and sustain the physical structure of nearshore habitats in Puget Sound. We used this PSNRP framework in the development of this document, and the ecosystem processes and management considerations that are included in this document are drawn from the PSNRP framework. This is an outline of what the document contains. It has 6 sections. The first section describes process-based restoration and a specific definition of resilience in the context of process-based restoration. We described the impacts of sea level rise that are important to consider for restoration. There's also a brief description of the Washington Coastal Resilience Project sea level rise projections developed in 2018. And in using these projections for planning and design of restoration projects, it is important for restoration professionals to think about the time frame and risk associated with a project in order to determine the most appropriate sea level rise projections to use. So the document includes a section specifically looking at factors to consider for timeframe and risk for restoration projects. The majority of the document focuses on different management measures that are commonly used in nearshore restoration projects and provides a list of considerations for sea level rise, depending on the management measure being used. The document concludes with some additional resources that users can explore to evaluate these considerations in more detail. Process-based restoration is the concept that restoration projects focus on restoring ecological processes. This results in a habitat structural response, and that habitat structure provides the ecological functions that we focus on restoring. So ecological processes that are discussed frequently in this document include sediment supply and transport, or accretion and erosion processes. And the document discusses how sea level rise can affect multiple aspects of this process restoration trajectory. We expect that resilient restoration projects are those that are most likely to continue to provide the habitat functions that we're concerned about in the face of change. So even as sea level rise changes these systems, a resilient restoration project will continue to provide ecological functions despite those changes. Sea level rise can impact ecosystem process restoration in multiple ways. It can have a direct effect on the ecosystem processes that we are seeking to restore. It can also affect that habitat structure, or it can affect the ecological functions that are the goal of restoration. The sea level rise impacts that are specifically covered in this document include impacts associated with waves and erosion, impacts associated with inundation or more frequent coastal flooding, saltwater intrusion, and changes in groundwater that can have effects both on the restoration site as well as adjacent properties and land use. When considering which sea level rise projections to use in evaluating the design of a restoration project, we provide a list of factors to consider. These include looking at whether or not the situation may be particularly risk averse. In the case of risk averse situations, restoration professionals are most likely to want to evaluate high magnitude, low likelihood projections. These risk averse situations include situations where there's an emphasis on protecting neighboring property and land uses, or restoration is focused on establishing or protecting critical species or habitats. Also when the potential to adapt future infrastructure or management is particularly limited. In contrast, some situations may be more risk tolerant. And in these risk tolerant situations, it can be appropriate to consider low magnitude, high likelihood projections. These situations include when the restoration project is being conducted in an ecosystem that has fairly intact ecosystem processes. It also may be a situation where there is sufficient upland space for migration of habitats. Another example of risk tolerant situations are when there is high potential to adapt either the infrastructure or vegetation management in the future. The majority of the document is focused on what we call considerations. And these considerations of sea level rise are grouped into three main categories. Considerations for the biophysical or habitat structure of the project, considerations for infrastructure components. Although this document is focused on restoration of ecosystem processes, we recognize that these types of restoration projects may also include infrastructure components such as setback dikes or culverts. And the third category is social political considerations that focuses mostly on stakeholder and landowner interactions. The document begins with a list of considerations that are relevant for all management measures. We expect these to be important regardless of the particular restoration action or management measure that is being used in the project. Then we list considerations for specific management measures. And we focus here on management measures that are most commonly used in restoration projects for ecosystem projects. These include acquisition of property, revegetation, removal of armor, groins, or other structures, removal of dikes or berms, and this is also commonly associated with rehabilitation of channels, hydrologic modification, and topographic restoration. These management measures are drawn specifically from the PISNERP framework, and additional information on the definitions of these is provided in those PISNERP materials. I want to provide an example of a consideration. So this is an example specifically for armor, groin, and structure removal. The way that these considerations are worded is as follows. Consider the extent to which current sediment input and transport processes in the drift cell are intact. So these types of considerations focus on evaluating the landscape context in which the restoration project is being done to determine the extent to which that landscape concept can add or hinder the resilience of the project. And each consideration is followed with 2 to 4 sentences describing the consideration in more detail. Another example of a consideration is as follows. Consider the extent to which there is upland space for increased shoreline erosion. So these types of considerations focus on understanding the components of a restoration project that may help increase its resilience. We expect the way that this document would be used is that a restoration designer would focus on the considerations that are listed specifically for the management measure that they expect to use in that restoration project. We also acknowledge that these management measures may be carried out differently in different shore forms. And so where relevant, we have added additional information about how that consideration may be more specific, whether that management measure is being used in beaches, embayment, or river delta shore forms. So lastly, I want to summarize the themes of the considerations for each of the 3 categories. So for biophysical habitat considerations, these considerations generally focus on landward migration of habitats, the different sediment supply and transport processes, as well as accretion rates that are expected in the area where the restoration project is being conducted. And finally, many have to do with the effects of inundation or saltwater tolerances of vegetation in the restoration project. These are 2 themes that are common to the infrastructure considerations. Most infrastructure considerations focus on how the protective structures will continue to function in the face of sea level rise, as well as the potential effects of saltwater intrusion or changes in groundwater hydrology for neighboring infrastructure and land uses. And the social political considerations generally focus on the risk or perceived risk of landowners and stakeholders, and how that risk of sea level rise combined with the restoration project may affect their willingness to conduct restoration or their political support for restoration. So that summarizes the general categories of considerations covered by the document. As I said in the beginning, the document is available online at the Washington Coastal Network website listed here. If you have any additional questions, comments, or feedback about the document, you can email any of the people listed here on this slide. And we would very much appreciate hearing how you find this document useful in planning and designing restoration projects in Puget.